administration is making very clear that you think the Affordable Care Act is invalid and should be struck down. What is your message to Americans?
Let me just tell you exactly what my message is. The Republican Party will soon be known as the party of health care. You watch. Thank you.
President Trump from within the hour. He's lunching today with Senate Republicans, their weekly conference meeting, and that should be wrapping up fairly shortly as we are live outside the Senate chamber, possibly hearing from Senate Republican and Democratic leaders. The Senate itself gavels back in shortly at 2:15 Eastern with the vote on the resolution concerning the Green New Deal is coming up this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern. Over in the U.S. House at this hour, Democrats have failed to move forward on a veto override of the president's emergency declaration. That vote just about wrapped up. They'd need 2/3 of those president voting to have the override. It's 248 to 181 right now. And the Senate gaveling back in after their party lunches. We'll take you live to the floor now here on C-SPAN 2.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Aye. Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, gotcha. Yes, I do. Thank you. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Got you. Thank you. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher. Thank you. Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, gotcha. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander.